welcome to a walk through Philippians. Last session, we looked at Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 to 19, and we see where Paul was writing from, and we see an incredible insight into how Paul viewed his current situation that he was in. And we know that he was in chains when he was writing this, he was imprisoned, and the way he looked at that, the lens he looked at it through was an incredible one. And he saw in such a hopeful and not just a mindlessly hopeful, but in a realistically hopeful way, he saw God's hand at work in many ways. And we looked at 6 different ways that the passage points out to how Paul saw God moving and working and advancing the gospel even in amongst that. And so today we're going to look at the topic, we're going to zoom out a bit and look at the topic in a little bit more of a broader way. So we see, and just by way of reminder, from Philippians chapter 1 verse 12, that Paul says, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually advanced the gospel." What Satan intended to cause disruption, distraction, despair, disappointment, to hold back what God was doing. In fact, it has done the very opposite and has worked and served to advance the gospel in various ways. Now, this incredible theme could be described as God's providential hand working good in hardship. Now, this is a very hopeful and wonderful theme that we actually see threaded right throughout the Bible and expressed in many, many different ways. If we think about providence, what providence is, I've heard it described as being a blend of God's absolute sovereignty, his authority, his power, his rule and reign, blended together with his wisdom. It's his wise and all-knowing counsel coming together with his absolute sovereignty. It is his purposeful governance over all things to achieve his desired ultimate end for all things. Ephesians 1 verse 11 says that he works all things together in accordance with the purpose of his good will. There are many examples that we could draw out of Israel's history, that we could see as all through Israel's history and spanning across hundreds of years. We could draw out examples of this reality at work, revealed in the scriptures, even in some of their darkest moments, the worst parts of Israel's history, where you feel sad just reading the stories, yet you see God's providential hand at work threaded in it. You see a light shining even in the darkest of places, a light that is full of hope and full of evidence of God's gracious hand at work in that situation and over the situation. And while there are many examples that we could look at, I'm just going to take 3 brief examples, draw them out as little pointers towards this great theme of God's providence at work in amongst hardship. Firstly is a story we know very well. It's Genesis chapter 50, this great story in the last chapters of Genesis, the story of Joseph, and how God brought the nation of Israel into Egypt for a time, and how he used Joseph to do that. And Joseph chapter 50 is coming to the conclusion of the story, and we see that Joseph's brothers were nervous as his father died. What was he going to do to them? If you recall the story, Joseph's brothers, through jealousy and anger towards him, they took him and they sold him as a slave, sold him into slavery. And Joseph went through many hardships and difficulties. He was imprisoned. He worked as a slave. He was falsely accused. He was forgotten in prison. And then he was drawn out of prison, and God used him to give to lead the nation of Egypt as the second in charge only to the Pharaoh, and to lead them through a time of famine, a time of plenty, and then a time of famine. And at the end of this, as Joseph's brothers had come through and been drawn into the nation, they'd actually been drawn there by a need to come get food. As this happened, we see Joseph describing what God had done throughout this whole situation, through all the hardship and difficulty. Joseph described it like this. His brothers came to him asking for forgiveness, and Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You planned evil against me in your jealousy, in your selling of me into slavery. They thought they were getting rid of him in that moment. You planned evil against me, but God planned it for good." That not God took the situation and made some good out of it, but God had a plan over that whole situation, that even in amongst the hardship, there was God's purposeful providence, his wise sovereignty at work, ruling and reigning over that situation for good, to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Isn't that an incredible thing? This horrible situation, this horrible thing that happened to Joseph, God's governance was over it for good. He planned it for good, that he could bring about the salvation of many. If we move to the New Testament and a more general example of this, we see a description of suffering as a father disciplining his child. Now, we often think of discipline just as punishment, but discipline is training. It's bringing up a child in God's ways. It's the shaping and molding. It's the coaching. It is the correcting, but it's the forming of a heart that a parent does to a child for their own good. And we see this incredible blend of that reality with God's work in our own lives in Hebrews chapter 12. So from verse 7, it says, "Endure suffering as discipline. God is dealing with you as sons. For what son is there that a father does not discipline? If you are without discipline, which all receive, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Furthermore, we had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shouldn't we submit even more to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time based on what seemed good to them. But he does it, God does it for our benefit." Listen to this, "so that we can share his holiness. No discipline seems enjoyable at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." Paul, as he was in prison, he didn't love what was happening. He didn't say, "Oh, yay, I'm in prison." But he saw a father at work in it, discipline, shaping, molding him for his own good and for the good of others. We must see, as we face hardship and difficulty, as Joseph saw it, we must see it as Satan working evil, but God working good in that situation. As we face hardship and difficulty, we can see it as difficulty, yes, but God as our great Father working in that situation, sharing with us his holiness. What a beautiful description this Hebrews 12 is of God's providential hand at work in amongst our hardship. And lastly, let's look at what I think is the pinnacle of God's providence at work, and that is in the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now, when we look at the climax of Jesus' ministry, his death and resurrection, we see the most terrible human act that ever happened in this world, and we think, wow, surely God is not involved in that process. God had nothing to do with that. How could he be involved in the worst thing that ever happened? But our hope is that not only is God there in that moment, but he is actually orchestrating it for our eternal good. Let's look at the worst situation that ever happened and see how the disciples, as they prayed in Acts chapter 4, describe what happened to Jesus. Acts chapter 4, verse 27. For in fact, in the city, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, assembled together against your holy servant, Jesus, whom you anointed. So Herod is handing over to the people, Pontius Pilate in his washing his hands and letting the people do as they would, and the Gentile soldiers mocking and hanging him on the cross, and the people of Israel shouting, crucify him, crucify him. And all these acts that came against Jesus, listen to this, they were done to do whatever God's hand and his will had predestined to take place. All these things were happening. Satan intended it for evil, but God's rule and reign was over these things and working them for the even in the worst situation that ever happened, he was there working it to be the best and most glorious situation that has ever happened. This is a great hope for us. This is a great joy for us who believe on our Lord Jesus, that it wasn't a random event that God turned for good, but instead it was his purposeful providence, his wise sovereignty at work, bringing about good. And we can take this hope and hold on to it. If this, in the worst situation that ever happened in the face of this world, in the history of mankind, the worst thing that ever happened was God's plan at work for the good of all people. Surely in our suffering and in our hardship, we can hold on to the hope that God is on the move and at work in that very situation. I want to share just 3 verses from perhaps my favorite hymn by William Cowper. It's an incredible one called God Moves in a Mysterious Way. And I think these 3 verses summarize this truth in a beautiful way. It says, deep in unfathomable minds of never failing skill, he treasures up his bright designs and works his sovereign will. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds you so much dread are filled with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. God bless you. And I trust that as you face whatever hardship you may face, you would see the God's purposeful sovereignty, God's gracious providence at work. And while the bud may have a bitter taste, sweet will be the flower.